Today we'll mostly be in John chapter 3. We'll spend a little time in chapter 2. And we've been looking through the Gospel of John and learning from John about how we can befriend others. We're looking at how Jesus related to people. And so we've seen just in general, in John chapter 1, we see that Jesus was the Word that came down and made his dwelling among us, and how important that is. Obviously, if we want to befriend others, then proximity and being around them is an important aspect of that. And then next we see that Jesus went and he connected with disciples. He had different men that he chose and called them to follow him. But as a part of that process, in the early stages, a lot of it was just letting them into his life, where he could just spend time with them and be with them. So there's the proximity, and then we talked about availability, that if we get too busy, too rushed, just too caught up in our own things, then it's really hard to make friends of others. It's hard to befriend others. So today we're going to look again at this interaction between Jesus and a Pharisee named Nicodemus, and we are going to learn one of the most important things that we will need to know about befriending others. And then we'll learn one other thing too. So one of the most important things that we can learn about befriending others, and that actually is going to come up in chapter 2, the very end. Now Jesus, while he was in Jerusalem at the Passover festival, many people saw the signs that he was performing, and they believed in his name. So Jesus now his ministry is becoming more and more public. He is performing signs, wonders, so people are believing in his name. But Jesus would not entrust himself to them, for he knew all people. And so it's interesting here, the Greek word that is in verse 23 that says that people believed, that word believed in his name, is the same exact word that is interpreted or translated to say entrust in verse 24. So Jesus was doing certain things, and people were putting their trust in him. They were believing in him, but Jesus would not believe in them. He would not entrust them. It goes on to say he did not need any testimony about mankind because he knew what was in each person. So Jesus knew what was in mankind as a whole, and he knew what was in each and every one of us. Now, it's interesting that this comes right before we meet Nicodemus. So, to better understand this, I suggest we buy a pet. We'll go simple, we'll go basic, we'll stick with dogs. All right, any dog lovers? Okay, let's pretend that you have never owned a dog before. Put yourself in that position, and you're thinking, I would really like to own a pet. Dogs look cute and cuddly. I would like to own a dog. And you know very little about dogs and dog ownership. So you just naively show up at the dog store or the pet shop or the kennel. Maybe you're one of those. You're gonna get a rescue dog, and so you show up and you look and you just, what are you going for? What size? Like there's all different factors of maybe you've got in your mind the kind of dog that you want. But you will very quickly find that you need to learn about dogs. What do they need? What do they want? What does this dog need? How big of a yard does it need? How often does it need to be walked? What does it need to be fed? How do I feed it? How often? There's so many things that go into pet ownership. How do I train the dog? And so buying a pet, I would recommend, before you go out and buy the dog, learn some things about dogs first. Now, some of us have had these experiences where you're sitting there thinking, Rob, I would never buy a dog because I hate dogs, or I am deathly afraid of dogs. Because at some point in your childhood, you saw a dog and you reached out to that dog and it bit you. And then forever ingrained in your head is dogs are evil. We cannot trust dogs. Some of you have very good experiences with dogs. You were a child and you had a furry best friend. And maybe the thing even slept at the foot of your bed, and you grew up, and it was just such a lovely, wonderful relationship. And so you've got just this rosy, rainbowed idea of pet ownership because you didn't do the grunt work. It was your parents who fed it, who paid for the food, who bought the leashes every third week because it kept chewing through them, who had to pick up the stuff that happened inside on the floor as the pet was getting trained, or because you went on vacation and the dog got mad at you and decided to leave a present for you in your bathroom or your new rug, And so you've got this rosy idea of what it means to own a pet. And so when you actually go and buy a pet, you're in for some kind of awakening. Maybe not a rude one, but an awakening. So you get to know what that experience is a little deeper. Now, what I'm suggesting is just kind of knowing. We need to be aware of, if we're going to interact with that thing for that long and that kind of intimacy, then you need to know it. Now, these things go deeper, right? Like in just kind of keeping with that idea of a dog, because I own a couple of dogs, and my dogs are mostly friendly, and so I have a positive view of dog kind, okay? And so if I go to say like a dog park with my dogs, and a dog runs up to me, I know what is in a dog. Okay, I have a clear view and understanding of what is in a dog. I know that in a dog there is the capability of friendship and compassion and warmth. That dog that runs up to me could wag his tail, want me to pat his head, maybe even would just, upon meeting me, roll over and expose his belly for a belly rub. Right? I'm like, hey, we just met, dude. Got to buy me dinner before I rub your belly. Or that dog could bite my hand off. We need to know what is in a dog. Right? Before we interact, I need to have a sober mind. I need to have a clear mind and know the possibilities. This dog could be friendly, or this dog could be terrible and violent. And so all of the things that we know, we kind of gauge those things. Is the tail wagging? Are the teeth showing? We kind of figure those things as the dog approaches us. But even then, if you know a dog, do the dog that you don't know, do you just get down and throw your arms around it? Do you go and put your hand quickly over its head? No, because when you get to know the animal, you understand this thing's going to need some time to get used to me, to know me, because I don't know its history. I don't know its past. Maybe there was a guy that looked like me or smelled like me or sounded like me that used to beat this dog. So the dog's all friendly, and then it hears my voice and it bites me. I need to know what's in a dog. Okay, all of this is comparing to what Jesus was saying, or what John was saying about Jesus. And this is I think one of the most important things we need to get when it comes to us being like Jesus and making friends like Jesus, is to understand this, is that Jesus knew what was in human beings. He knew our capability. He knew that he could go perform miracles, and he could have signs and wonders, and that a lot of people would love that, and they would want to be a part of that. And they would want to get to know him better. And they would want to be a part of his entourage. And they would want to follow him. And they would want to be partakers of the good things that he was giving out. But Jesus could not and did not entrust himself to them because he knew what was in them. So I'm not saying, kids, you can't trust anybody. I'm not saying we can't trust people, but we can't entrust ourselves to people. Or if you entrust yourself to people, you need to do it fully knowing what people are capable of. Right? And so we have the same thing. Some of us have had really good experiences with people, and so we become very trusting. We're very open-hearted. We're willing to let people in. And if we get hurt, it's okay. We got hurt. We can move on. Some people are very guarded because early on we had bad experiences. We were hurt by the people that were closest to us, so that makes us kind of keep people away. We just need to know what is in people. I think knowing puts us in a great situation and position to actually be able to befriend. Because I could go at it on one extreme and feel like, I'm going to put all my hope in this person. I'm going to entrust myself to them. We're going to be best friends. It's going to be amazing. We're going to skip through the park together. We're going to like all the same movies. We're going to, and 50 years from now, we'll probably, go on vacations, and we'll probably even be roommates. Who knows? And so you can kind of put all this, and then as soon as that person turns their back on you, as soon as they say, actually, I'm too busy for that, or they stop calling you back, or they don't text you back, or they don't respond, or they don't, where are you left? And I'm not saying don't put hope in that. I'm not saying don't value relationships. It's just don't overvalue or don't get caught up. Understand what is in humans. Understand our capacity and our capability. And I was thinking about this question, and I think it's interesting the interaction that Jesus will then have with Nicodemus, and I just feel like there's so many layers to it. But this, are you trustworthy? I think that's a good thing to think about. Like, are you trustworthy? Like, if Jesus was here today, should he entrust himself to you? Would you be worthy of that? Are you worthy of the trust of Jesus Christ? Or would you let him down? Would something happen? Would something come up and you would say, Jesus, I've got this other opportunity. I think I'm going to go over here. I'm going to do that thing instead. There's a really good thing to be thinking about. Are you trustworthy? I think for most of us, we would say no. Like at some point, we'd let Jesus down. Now, it's also interesting that God puts quite a bit of trust in us to fulfill his mission. But this, I just think this is really, really an important thing for us to get. And it's in there, it's in the scriptures there, that Jesus didn't need anybody to come and take him aside and say, hey, you need to watch out for these people or those people. Jesus understood. He knew what was in man. This is kind of the end. This is the end of his conversation with Nicodemus, and he says this is the verdict. Light has come into the world, but people loved darkness. So chapter 2 ends with John telling us Jesus knows what people were all about. And then Jesus goes on and he has this conversation with Nicodemus, in essence telling Nicodemus, this is what people are all about. So Jesus knows it, and he's passing this knowledge on to Nicodemus. Jesus didn't need to have a testimony about who people were or what mankind was, but maybe Nicodemus did. And so Jesus is saying, this is what it's all about. Light has come into the world, but people love darkness instead of light because their deeds were evil. Everyone who does evil hates the light and will not come into the light for fear that their deeds will be exposed. But whoever lives by the truth comes into the light so that it may be seen plainly that what they have done has been done in the sight of God. And so there's people that are going to love light, and there's people that are going to hate light. And Nicodemus, as you go into the world, you need to know this, that you could live righteously and live purely and do well, and people will hate you for it. And it's also interesting that Nicodemus has come to Jesus at night. And so Jesus is saying, people who are doing evil deeds like the cover of darkness because their evil deeds won't be exposed. And I'm not suggesting that Nicodemus coming to talk to Jesus is an evil thing, but he would be able to understand and apply that. Because why is he coming to Jesus at night? Because he doesn't want that to be exposed. He doesn't want his cronies, his Pharisee buddies, to be like, whoa, why were you talking to Jesus? What were you talking to him about? He wants to do this under the cover of night. So just like you know that sometimes we want to do things and don't want those things to be found out, that's what the world is about. Maybe your things aren't evil tonight, but that's how people are. We all have things. We all have something evil that if I was like, right now, we're just going to go around the room. Everybody tell one evil thought you had this week or one terrible thing you did. Very quick, we start over here. People would be walking out the door back here. Like, okay, you guys make a distraction. It makes a diversion over there. Because no, we're not interested in that. I don't want you to know those things about me. I don't want that to be exposed. And so we want the great things from Jesus and from each other, but sometimes, that's the nature of humankind. It's how we are. It's one of the big things that Jesus is conveying, and I don't think we can really, truly befriend people unless we know. Having that knowledge is so important on the front end. Maybe that clicks. There's probably some people who are like, yeah, that's so good. And some of you are like, what? And that's okay. You'll get it someday. Like, oh yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead. I'm going to read through John chapter 3. We're going to read the rest of this interaction between Jesus and Nicodemus, and then we'll kind of figure out the other thing that we can learn for how we can befriend others. This other thing is not the way that you would read on the internet or in a textbook of how to make friends or how to befriend others. This is a like Jesus type thing. All right, so John chapter 3, verse 2. He came to Jesus at night and said, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him. Jesus replied, very truly I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless they are born again. How can someone be born when they are old? Nicodemus asked. Surely they cannot enter a second time into their mother's womb to be born. Jesus answered, very truly I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they are born of water and the Spirit. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but the Spirit gives birth to spirit. You should not be surprised at my saying, you must be born again. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. How can this be? Nicodemus asked. You are Israel's teacher, said Jesus, and do you not understand these things? Very truly, I tell you, we speak of what we know and we testify to what we have seen, but still, you people do not accept our testimony. I have spoken to you of earthly things, and you do not believe. How then will you believe if I speak of heavenly things? No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, and whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe stands condemned already, because they have not believed in the name of God's one and only Son. So the one thing Jesus does entering into the conversation is that he has a good and true understanding of what are people, what is Nicodemus, what's in his heart, what does he have the capacity to do? Could he be my friend? Could he be my supporter? Could he be a disciple? Could he be a backstabber, a betrayer? Could he be one that listens to me a couple of times and then walks away and tells others that I'm not the Messiah? All of those things could be. So Jesus went into it with a sober mind, understanding what people are. The other thing that Jesus did was he lifted the conversation to be about spiritual things. He does it several times. He takes normal, everyday, physical, worldly, fleshly things and gives it the spiritual meaning. He brings up the spiritual truth behind it. What is it that Nicodemus wants? What is it that he needs? He starts off and he says, Jesus, like, we know that you must be from God because you're doing these signs and wonders, things that we can't explain, physical things. We can see it. We can see the person get healed. We can hear your teaching that just is so profound and amazing, but we can't explain it. We can't understand where it comes from. And Jesus gives him explanation. That's how the Spirit works. You don't know where it came from. You don't know where it's going. And that's how the people of the Spirit are. And to be a person of the Spirit, you have to be born again. You have to be born from above. You have to be born of the Spirit. Well, Nicodemus is so focused on the physical realm. So that's why he's confused. What do you mean born again? I can't go back into my mother's womb. No, we're talking about spiritual things now, Nicodemus. And he makes that clear. He spells it out. And then he'll use other things that Nicodemus would have been familiar with. It's, Nicodemus, what it's like is it's like me, it's like Moses. And back in the day when all of the people had gotten bit by snakes and they were all poisoned and they were all going to die, God gave a special snake to Moses, and he lifted it up. He lifted it up on a staff in front of the people, and whoever looked at that snake would be healed. And that's the same thing that's going on in the spiritual realms, is that everyone kind of has a bit of a spiritual poison, and they're all destined to die, but God is going to lift me up, alluding to the cross, and whoever looks on me and believes in me, they'll be saved from that spiritual death. So he takes the things that he knows, the things that he's familiar with, and he lifts them up. He changes the conversation to be a spiritual conversation. This is not isolated. This is not only happening in this story. Jesus does it several other times and in several other ways. All right. Here, just in a little bit, in John chapter 5, the first 9 verses, Jesus encounters a man who is by a pool. He believes that an angel is going to come and stir the waters of the pool, and if he jumps in, if he gets in, then he'll be healed. He won't be lame anymore. And so Jesus says, do you want to get well? And he's like, I don't have anybody to help me. He's talking about something that's very physical. And Jesus says, do you want to get well? And Jesus is starting to change the conversation to a spiritual one. He uses the guy's physical ailment and kind of moves it to spiritual. John chapter 6 is when Jesus feeds 5,000 people, and then they all follow him, and they're like, Jesus, give us more of that bread. Keep feeding us. Keep giving us bread. And he says, I'm the bread. And sometimes it's at the peak of, because Jesus knows how people are, he knows that if I keep feeding you, you'll keep following. Not because you love me or you believe in me, it's because you're hungry and I'm feeding you. Because at the base, that's how people are. We have that struggle with church. We have that struggle. Should our gatherings be entertaining? No, they should be spiritual. Spiritual first. We need to be about God. But if you came in and all of our songs were, you'd probably leave because you're a person and we're fickle. And there'd be 10 people left and we'd be like, oh, those people just aren't spiritual like we are. And we'd be right, kind of. Right? But it's about taking the reality of the physical and the flesh, but we lift it up and we turn it spiritual. In John chapter 9, you've got the man born blind. And Jesus uses that to kind of teach and talk to the Pharisees. And there's a lot of confusion about it. And at the end, though, he's able to say, in all of what happened, don't you realize that even though you guys can see, you're the ones who are really blind? And so what Jesus does, and I think the key is, what we want to be looking for is finding the intersection, right? Here's the physical thing. Here's the physical thing that we're talking about, that's what is going on, and where does that intersect with the spiritual realms? And if we can find that point, then we've got a place to kind of turn the conversation. Sometimes we don't even really have to try hard, or sometimes it can be something that's premeditated, that we kind of know. I really want to have a spiritual conversation with somebody. And so we bring up the topic, and we can lead with it. But that's what Jesus did. In John chapter 8, a woman who's caught in adultery comes to Jesus, or is brought to Jesus, and they're like, we want to stone her. And he's like, but they're like, well, what should we do? They're trying to trap Jesus, and he pauses. And he doesn't answer them. And he writes something in the sand. And then he does. He says, the famous words like, he who is without sin cast the first stone. So how can, this is to the points now, like how can we do this? How can we turn our conversations into spiritual conversations? And so one thing we can do is we can pause and we can pray. Here's a couple of scriptures for a second thing we can do. This is Romans 8. It says, if you live according to verse 13, if you live according to the flesh, you'll die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, and you'll live. And in Galatians 5 says that those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. Since they live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. And in kind of the same vein, Colossians 3 says, since you've been raised with Christ, having died, set your hearts on things above where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things above, not on earthly things. So we can definitely try to learn how to pause in situations and not have to answer immediately, but learn how to, in the middle of a conversation, say a little prayer to God and say, God, can you give me the words? But the biggest thing we can do to kind of turn our conversations to spiritual things is to be spiritual people. Is to just be spiritual people. If you feast day after day on the news, you're going to be able to talk to people about the news. If you are constantly putting yourself in knowing what's going on with sports or fashion, you're going to be able to talk to people about sports and fashion. Even if it doesn't make sense, you're going to find a way. They're going to be like, the weather. They're talking about the weather. They're doing the weather conversation. They're like, yeah, too bad the Braves game got rained out last night. You will find a way because that's what you know. So if you know Jesus and are filled with his Spirit, then you will find a way to talk about Jesus. Number 3, practice it. Practice it. Practice with each other. Okay? If all of our conversations are about sports and fashion and the news, we are failing. We need some of that. We need small talk, get to know each other a little better, get to know your likes, your dislikes, your interests, and all of that. That's all fine and good. But we need to practice on each other, turning those normal conversations into spiritual conversations, turning the physical things into spiritual things. So in Matthew chapter 16, this is Matthew's account of after Jesus fed the 5,000. And Matthew says, so they get in the boat, and the disciples had forgotten the bread. And Jesus says, hey guys, watch out for those Pharisees. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. And they are all confused. They're like, is he saying this because we forgot the bread? They're so caught up in the physical world, and he's with them all the time. And he says, you of little faith. And notice when Jesus says you of little faith, so often it's not necessarily because these guys made a move that was like, oh, that showed that they didn't really trust Jesus. It's when their minds are in the earthly gutter, or not even that. Their minds are so fixated on the physical that they can't see that Jesus is talking about spiritual things. Jesus is training them. Jesus is practicing with them. Do you still not understand? Do you still not get it? We're not talking about bread. We're talking about their teaching. And so we need to practice with one another. So the more spiritual we are as just people, what we consume, what we put ourselves in and with and around, and the more we can practice with each other, then the more naturally we'll go out into the world and with classmates and with coworkers and with neighbors, our conversations will just be spiritual. We won't have to force it. We won't have to figure out ways to make them spiritual. It'll just be what we know and what we do. That's very ideal. It's very ideal. But that's what we're doing right now. We're in a season of practice. We're in a season of practice, and we're running kind of this campaign of encouragement where we want to encourage you to go out and have good conversations. So just practice that. The person that maybe you would normally walk by, say, you know what, I should have a good conversation with that person. Say, hey, actually, you know what? How are you doing today? No, I mean, really, how are you? What's going on? What's going on in your life? Tell me about your family. Tell me about work. What's stressing you out? What's really got you happy lately? Go from not talking to people or having just those mundane interactions to having good quality conversations because you care about them. And then because you're a spiritual person and because you love God and you know God and because God is in you and alive in you, you're going to start talking about God. And then if that connects and that person shows interest, then ideally we'll find opportunity to talk about the gospel and talk about Jesus and the good news of what he's done for us. So again, we want to encourage people. We've got a display out in the foyer there in the lobby with 3 different color ping pong balls that kind of designate, did you have a good conversation? Did you have a God conversation? Did you have a gospel conversation? And for each one of those conversations that you have in the next 5 or 6 weeks, we want you to grab one of those ping pong balls and put it in that display. We've got 8,000 ping pong balls. And I believe that after 6 weeks, we can use every single one of those. The display won't hold all of them, but I think we can use every single one of those ping pong balls as an encouragement, not because that's the kind of people we want to be, because we're trying to be like Jesus. And we want to have conversations like Jesus had, and we want to befriend like Jesus befriended. Let's stand together and sing.